This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today, I'd like to turn back towards the last two contributions in this video series on common sense. In the United States, for a few months now, there's been a dynamic and tumultuous process unfolding, and one of the ways that it has been spoken of is as a revolution in common sense. And some of the characteristic features of these developments involve amplification of feelings of nationalism, an amplification of feelings of economic competition between nation states and nations, focus on competition in getting access to natural resources around the earth and the planet that we are all sharing. And the last two episodes, I presented some what I consider really inspiring and unique perspectives on common sense. And while we might not be used to it, connecting the idea of common sense to connecting the idea of common sense to the idea of aesthetics, there actually is a deep relationship between common sense and aesthetics. And that aesthetics as a term, as recently as 200 years ago, was adopted because it meant knowledge gained through experience and through the senses. And it might be surprising to many people to think of Rudolf Steiner as a person in whose work we can find a really multifaceted aesthetic theory or theory of common sense and knowledge through experience. It turns out that this can be found, which I've tried to show in the last two episodes. And not only that, but that it has had remarkable influence, even while it has been marginalized and not a lot of people know about it. It has had a remarkable influence on the history of the last 100 years, as Dan McKanan has shown in his book Eco-Alchemy, which I already referred to. I'm not going to say much about it now. But today, for those of you who are studying in college or university level in political theory or the social sciences or philosophy or economics, I want to try to connect and contextualize a little bit what I think is offered by this view of common sense, which would indeed mean a revolution in common sense, but not one that focused on heightening nationalism or heightening economic competition and trade wars, and would certainly not involve turning a blind eye to the given limits of the planet that is the foundation not only of the economy but of society and in general, social life in general. So in such a short episode, of course I can only share some indications, but I tried to choose two philosophers or political theorists that in a way are on very different sides of a spectrum, and to try to show that the perspectives that the revolution of common sense or aesthetic education in its really big comprehensive meaning, as I've tried to relate in the last two episodes, when that aesthetic culture is not developed or isn't able to be recognized, there's a kind of a gap. And in both of these theories, which I think they kind of in almost a symbolic or iconic way on two different sides of this issue, this gap can become very clear. And the first thinker that I would like to introduce is Martin Heidegger. And now Martin Heidegger is not, of course, known as an economist or even a political theorist, but still his work is in a way indicative of a certain direction of philosophy and thought in relationship to the modern economy and to technology. And the social specialization and division of labor, which is the reality that we live in the modern world. To kind of lift up at least one of his contributions to this question, which I think is, again, brings to expression the way a lot of people try to come to terms with modern society, the modern economy, and social specialization. We can look at his essay, The Question Concerning Technology. It's a very interesting essay, and it's very well known. And for those of you who would like to look at it, I'll put the reference in the show notes, under the show notes. And his approach is in a way indicative of a lot of approaches that we might find, for instance, that we find also in Hans-Georg Gadamer, or to some extent in Charles Taylor, and many political thinkers who are inspired by phenomenology and by what we could call, after Charles Taylor, philosophical anthropology and hermeneutics, or interpretive human sciences. So what does Heidegger offer? Well, he develops a perspective through introducing the fact that the root word of technology can be traced back to techne in Greek antiquity, and that techne was a term that not only referred to machines or devices or contraptions, but to poetry and to art, sculpture, architecture, painting, techne. And he refers to the use of the word and how techne itself was a way of working and creating so that the essence of something could be revealed in human experience, that there was a kind of revealing that took place. And referring most clearly and repeatedly to poetry, Heidegger suggests that the essence of techne, as it was understood in antiquity, even in what we might think of as more technical applications, was actually experienced as a kind of process of revealing that happened through human fabrication and human production and human creativity. And the modern use of the word techne or technology has changed dramatically. Heidegger points out that the modern way of thinking is, in a way, what he wants to get at. Not necessarily, machines or engines. I mean, we have to remember he lived before the digital age, but cinema or television, these are not the things he wants to be reflecting on in his essay concerning technology in any narrow way. Instead, it's a way of thinking. And this is how he characterizes this way of thinking. It is a way of seeing all of the elements of existence as having within themselves a kind of function or a lawfulness that allows them to be controlled and to be translated and manipulated or worked with in a way as we choose, as the creators of technology. So the whole existence is a kind of interwoven, we could say, mathematical matrix or web of functional relationships and technological thinking in the modern sense is this way of picturing things, and then also of manipulating elements and things so that some kind of outcome is achieved. But Heidegger points out that the outcome is in a way predetermined by the attitude. Because of the fact that the world is approached technologically, and now we're talking about this kind of thinking, it has in a way a value cooked into it, and that value is what he calls working for a standing reserve. So trying to create a situation where there is some standing reserve, where there's something which is created, which is a resource which can be used by human beings and for some good. This is somehow implicit in this way of thinking for Heidegger. And Trish Glazebrook, who I'll also put a note in the references about, a contemporary political theorist who in many ways works with this orientation from Heidegger, looking at standing reserve as profit, or the kind of profit organizational thinking and trying to be efficient and to create profits as the kind of underlying value of a lot of modern organization, business, attitudes, which certainly we are all familiar with. So, what is Heidegger's solution to this situation? Before I get to that, I want to just refer back to the last episodes. And, one way to look at this way of thinking about the economy, which we find kind of indicated in Heidegger and then maybe more explicitly drawn out by Trish Glazebrook, about natural science and technology, or the modern economy, is that it's largely anaesthetic. Now, I've spoken in the last 2 episodes about aesthetic education in this larger sense that embraces natural science and economics. And now when I use the word anaesthetic, we're used to, receiving anesthetics when we want to remove our experience or sensation from, say, for instance, for a medical procedure or because we're in pain. And in a certain way, we can see natural science today and the modern economy as anesthetic in character, when they have this kind of abstract texture for us, and the way that we engage with it is largely abstract. It's not aesthetic, it's anesthetic, or we could also say highly rational. And noticing this, I think having a feeling for this, Heidegger then, instead of trying to find how to develop aesthetic judgment or modes of aesthetic knowledge in natural science, let's say physics or biology, or to try to understand how aesthetic judgment or knowledge through experience is important for economic life, he goes back to what we all know aesthetics to refer to, which is art. And he pretty much suggests that art, or positions art as the way to address, let's say, the dangers of the modern economy and technological thinking. What are the dangers for Heidegger? Well, the dangers are that eventually, if we have this one-sided way of thinking technologically, which I've tried to characterize following him, eventually it's going to even be applied to ourselves. We're going to apply it to ourselves. We ourselves are going to become mere elements in a matrix of order that we can manipulate for different reasons in order to achieve some end. So we can think about, of course, in one way, Heidegger seems prophetic when we look at the ways that a lot of media enterprises have looked at human beings not primarily as autonomous beings who should be supported to maintain that autonomy and or citizens, but as not only consumers, but as products. And it is perhaps a well-known phrase that on social media today, most people are not getting something for free. Instead, they are being sold through giving up their data of their behavior to advertising companies and others, also politicians or political movements. And in a way, we can see something prophetic in Heidegger here for sure. And at the same time, his solution he pretty much suggests that if we go in this direction, we will be incorporated into this technological spirit, and we will lose the capacity to experience revealing as we experience it, for instance, through art. And the eclipse of the capacity for revealing. And this is for Heidegger the essence of technology, not outer technology, but a kind of inner culture of modern technology and modern science and thinking. He closes the essay with the words, "We bear witness to the crisis that in our sheer preoccupation with technology, we do not yet experience the coming to presence of technology. That in our sheer aesthetic mindedness, we no longer guard and preserve the coming to presence of art." And when he is referring to the coming to presence of technology, it is the increasing marginalization of the aesthetic mindedness of revealing through art. As I've already mentioned, there are a number of directions in political theory, particularly in philosophy, where we see this kind of turn towards art, and I would say also romanticism, as a kind of way of coming to terms with the dangers, which I think are very real, which are connected with the modern technology, the current natural scientific culture, which is anaesthetic, and also the modern economy. But when we look at this situation that Heidegger suggests, and many others, we can really see the unique contribution that Rudolf Steiner was able to develop. Over the course of his life, he really only put the pinnacle on this part of his work at the end of his life with his course on economics. So now I'd like to turn to a very, very different direction in thought, and which comes from the left, which comes from an individual who is inspired by and associated with the critical school of Frankfurt. And if you don't know anything about that, no problem. But those of you who are studying philosophy or political theory, maybe even the social sciences or economics in some contexts, you'll be very familiar with that school, including Adorno, Marcuse, Walter Benjamin. And in this instance, I'm going to speak about Julian Stahlebras. And this is a really kind of characteristic move in some ways. I'm not going to suggest, of course, that the Frankfurt School has some kind of consensus on the modern situation, which would be ridiculous. But we do have many people associated with this kind of school that take a very different approach because of their interest in social justice and in the modern economy as a possible source of social justice, and also technology and science. And in Julian Stahlebras' essay, which actually appeared as a very short introduction to contemporary art in the Oxford series already a while ago, I'll again provide the reference under the show notes. He paints a picture of art as one of the main obstacles of social progress. And he does it through an analysis of museums. And he pretty much suggests that he describes art as it's understood in Europe and the United States and around most of the world as a way of creating objects that really aren't useful, but they open up like an imaginative, utopian picture or experience of existence. One of the strengths of art is that it allows us to kind of ignore for a moment or to displace ourselves in an experience of beauty or wonder or imagination where the laws of nature, also the immediate social situation that we're in is for a moment suppressed or oppressed, and we have a kind of imaginative experience of beauty, of being moved. Of course, referring back to Heidegger, he would describe this as a kind of revelation of something eternal, or at least Hans-Georg Gadamer, one of his closest kindred thinkers, would. So for Stahlebras, however, in looking at this, he wants to try to look at how it plays itself out in the modern economy. And he looks at museums, and he sees museums and kind of suggests museums are places where artists are cultivated to present paintings or sculptures or action performance art without any concern for usefulness or any kind of necessarily having a statement about anything. And they're exhibited in different museums. And then there are some things that the public or people who visit the museum really respond to. And then these kind of take on a life of their own and become very fashionable. And he suggests that this kind of, there's some kind of dynamic at play here where exhibitions are made and then looking for something that really stirs a lot of people's interest. So it's kind of like testing a product against an audience from this perspective. And this then becomes a kind of style or fashion, texture or ideas that can inspire, plays or TV shows or, clothing lines or music but things that can be sold for consumption, entertainment. And this is really how he analyzes the current museum complex. And, he certainly has a point with a lot of tendencies in the world of the art world or also museum culture in some places. Now, what is the point? Where does he get to with this? Because again, here we're talking about aesthetic experience and really being focused on art again. And he points out that, when you have these experiences of art, you really are blinded to the ecological and the social dimensions of the planet. And you live off in this utopian window and enjoy yourself, whether it be a more profound experience with art or maybe just entertainment. And art, so objects that are created in this way without any evident use, so for beauty or entertainment, they play a role from one perspective of making us less aware of the ecological and social realities of other people around the world who are producing goods, maybe also the fashionable goods that we are buying with the art print on them, or the handbag, or even the prints of art that are sold in the gift shop when you're exiting the museum. And also all of the ecological realities connected to that. A quote from him to kind of get his voice in here a little stronger is, so when you look at the art world, we see component parts of a uniform machine, quote, which produces a large range of novel combinations that are tested against various publics, end quote. So what do these do? They open a utopian window, and he suggests then this is a real problem for the modern economy, but also all questions about ecological sustainability and social justice. And he suggests to overcome this kind of capitalism, he suggests, quote, to break the autonomy of free art is to remove one of the masks of free trade. Or to put it the other way around, if free trade is to be abandoned as a model for global development, so must its ally, free art, end quote. So ultimately, he comes to a really different perspective from Heidegger or Trish Glazebrook, through eliminating creating objects as moments of free expression that are not for any use, but have a kind of value in themselves as moments of expression. If we could eliminate all of that, then we could begin to bring into our awareness the ecological and social conditions of the planet and be able to counter some of the negative, destructive trends of modern society. Now, here we have just on the other side of the spectrum, again, a kind of composition, a riddle of thought where the economy and the kind of technological foundation of the economy and also the natural world are excluded from our aesthetic culture. Really, the only place that we have aesthetic culture is in art and entertainment and mass entertainment commercial industries like Netflix or what have you, also social media. But these ultimately, permeated with this artistic ethos alone, make us numb or alienated to the economic reality of the earth and to the ecological reality of the earth. And so he's like, well, let's just get rid of art, this kind of art. So maybe he would really be in favor of social realism, I don't know, which is, kind of communist art. But here again, there's this gap, there's this gap that when you look at Rudolf Steiner's notion, this notion of aesthetic education that is not only about art, but it also is very important for natural science and for a social cooperative economics. It's really amazing because it speaks right to the issue, but it does so without suggesting that art should be banned, which we find in, or let's say, the conception of art that we know in Europe and the United States should be banned, nor does it have the quality of Heidegger or Gadamer, and less so Taylor and Glazebrook, but of being anachronistic and romantic. And as I mentioned at the top of this episode, Dan McKanan has kind of shown that this aesthetic culture, this comprehensive, robust aesthetic culture, he didn't focus on any influence that it had in the arts. He focused on the fact that it had an influence on the emergence of the environmental movement and green social banking in Europe and the United States, including the emergence of the community-supported agricultural movement and the kind of thinking around that. And so we see, on the one hand, through Dan McKanan, that these ideas or this comprehensive aesthetic culture has shown that it has what I would consider some really valuable contribution towards a revolution of common sense. And on the other hand, it really speaks directly to some of the gaps and the dissatisfaction with solutions that are coming out of, let's say, left-leaning critical or Marxian inspired political theorists and conservative, phenomenologically inspired or hermeneutically inspired theorists. Using those terms is somewhat crude, but it does capture something, because all of these thinkers have to be taken on their own merits. So today I wanted to again address the so-called revolution of common sense in the United States. And I think that it is right that there be intense resistance inwardly towards a lot of the things that are happening right now in the United States. And I don't say that in order to defend the United States as it existed before the moment that we are in now in recent decades. The wars, the imperialism, a lot of the kind of almost technocratic tendencies in education, but also in, let's say, health, all of those things are part of leading to the moment that we're in right now. But I can take absolutely no joy in seeing what is happening right now in the United States. And it's not just a matter of having criticisms regarding what's happening, but it's a matter of trying to come up with ideas that can inspire some positive, hopeful alternative to dealing with the issues that have really led us to the point that we're in right now. And that is certainly not going back to the status quo in the United States. So I offer this as a humble contribution in that direction, these last 3 episodes. And I do hope that they find some resonance for those of you who are struggling also with the kind of political theory or political scientific perspective on these things, and trying to come up with ways to think that evade the ideological platforms that are so dominant and really kind of involve thinking with blinders on. So trying to think without blinders, or as Hannah Arendt said, thinking without a handrail. And we will certainly do more of that, I think, in the coming time. Thank you for listening to all of that. Questions of Courage is a very simple project. The production costs are very low, but I am able to do this because of the fact that the Goethe Annum exists and the communications team, and I want to invite you, if you appreciate this, to contribute in some way to the youth section. Any funds that you contribute will go towards youth work, and not necessarily more podcasts, though possibly, but other things as well. And if you want to learn more about that, I invite you to look at the youth section website. Have a great day or night wherever you are.